To views at Twin Cities Drupal Camp. I'm hoping you're in the right place right now. If you're not expecting to be here, then by all means feel free to get up and walk out at any time, or walk in. Either option is totally fine by me. I am Les Slim. I am one of the co-organizers of Twin Cities Drupal Camp, me and about a dozen and a half other wonderful people from the Twin Cities. I'm on Twitter if you want to give me a follow, at LesMana, or if you have any questions about this talk that you'd like to ask me after the fact that you maybe didn't think about, go ahead and give me a tweet. I'm usually pretty responsive about that kind of thing. I've been using Drupal since roughly 2006. I currently work at a company called 10-7 in Minneapolis, and our sponsor table is down in the atrium. And so, if you have some time, go downstairs and look for me or give my boss a shout out. He'd be happy to hear from you. We're here to talk about views, and there are a few things that I want to make sure that we come away from this talk with. And that we get that cleared up before we go. The first thing is I want to just make sure that everybody understands the concept of views in Drupal, when you might want to leverage views and when you might not want to leverage views for a particular use case. I want us to look at configuration options within the views interface and inspect the way in which each of those configuration options changes the way the view behaves. Finally, I just want us to make sure that we understand some of the conventions that are going on in the interface reviews, because it turns out that some of the user interface things that you see in the views module aren't really replicated elsewhere throughout Drupal. It does some things on its own that are a little bit weird, and so I want to make sure that we have the visual vocabulary to understand what's going on there. A quick side note, I also am told, and I understand, I talk way too fast for my own good. And that sometimes that I can trip over myself, or people have a hard time understanding me. If that's happening, give me a shout. Just interrupt me, tell me, and I will make a conscious effort to slow down. That's something I struggle with my entire life. So by all means, let me know. I'm happy to know about it when it's happening. So first, what is views? What are views? Views is a bit of a grammatical conundrum in that you will hear people use views as a singular noun or as a plural noun, and that's usually a clue that views is being talked about in maybe slightly different ways when you hear that word. There are, I think, 3 different ways that the word views is used and that mean various things. One of the ways that people use views is to refer to the module known as views. So it's shorthand for the views module. So like when I'm saying, is views enabled, for example, I'm actually asking, is the views module enabled? It sounds weird because I'm asking, is views, but I'm using views as a singular to refer to the module in that case. People also talk about views to talk about the actual tool that is enabled when you enable the Drupal module. It's a Drupal tool for configuring dynamic lists, and by dynamic meaning lists that are able to change when the circumstances of your content changes. Lists that you do not have to manage yourself in order to make sure that it's showing the right things. And the third way that people actually talk about views are individually. Views are lists. Views are the items that are created by the Drupal tool that configures dynamic lists. So gets a little dicey when you hear the word views, but know that there are contexts, and you'll pick up on those pretty quickly, I hope, throughout the talk. So let's talk about quickly each of these 3 things. When I say that views is shorthand for the views module, I'm actually talking about like when you go to the extend page in your Drupal interface. So you're in your management bar and you're looking at your extend tab that has all of your modules. The screenshot here is of the module interface that the field in the top here gives me the ability to search for modules in the list. And so if I look for views, you can see that views is present. I have both views and the views user interface module enabled. So views module is enabled. That's the way I'm referring to it in this case. But I'm also considering the use case when somebody talks about views as the Drupal tool. What actually is made available to Drupal when you turn that module on, and that is the administrative interface for views. That lives in your management tab under the structure area, and it's alphabetical, so it's at the very bottom. There's views. That's where we'll go to when we want to get at the configuration for various views. And then the third way that we refer to views as the actual objects themselves. Views are lists of objects. So there are a number of examples in Drupal 8 and in Drupal core of views that are already present out of the box when you install Drupal. One is the front page. The front page of your site shows what we refer to as sort of the river of content. But it's content on your site that's being listed in chronological order backwards, and they're the teasers of your site. This is actually being prepared as a view, and that view comprises the front page view of your website. Another example of a view that's available in Drupal core out of the box is the administrative listing of file entities and file objects that are available to you on the site. This is available to you in the Manage interface under the Content tab. This looks very different from the front page view, but it's still a view. It's a listing of objects that are being managed in the Drupal database. In this case, it happens to be files. This is also a view. In the block interface in Drupal core, there's a block that you can place into a region of your theme, the Who's Online block. The purpose of that is to show you users who have logged in the last 15 minutes. That's how Drupal considers a user to be online. This is actually also a view as well. It's not a page. It is a block that you can place on a page, but it is still considered a view on the site. I want to talk about how each of these views examples works. But before we can get into those examples, we need to understand some of the key components that comprise what constitutes what's shown in a view. So those components are, there is a base, which tells Vue what is the kind of thing that I'm going to put into this list. Am I going to put content in this list? Is this list going to be primarily about users on the site? Or maybe is the list I'm creating about taxonomy terms? What is the actual type of thing that I want to arrange in my list? Format is another component, and that's, I know that I'm displaying content in my site. How should I display this content? Should I put them in a grid format? Should I display them as a table on the site? Should they just be arranged in an unordered list item in the HTML? Additionally, it's not just arranging, it's how does each item look? Does each item look like a teaser? Is it a node teaser or a user profile, a small user profile? Is it a list of fields from each individual content type? That comprises the format component. Filters are rules that govern what items am I going to put into this particular list. I know I'm going to be displaying, for instance, content in my list, but am I going to be displaying all content? Or am I only going to be displaying content that are articles or are blog posts instead? Filters allow you to winnow down that list to only the particular items that you are looking for. There are sort criteria, which are rules that help the view understand what order the items go in, which items go first and which items go progressively after that. Finally, the fifth component is the display, which is how do we tell Drupal how to understand how to use this view? And these are kind of fuzzy concepts right now, and we'll get into those in a little bit. I just wanted to make sure that we put these five components and these 5 words out there up front, because we're going to refer to these quite a bit throughout these examples. So to explain a little bit more about what these examples mean, let's look at the front page, for example, and identify each of these 5 criteria for the front page view. So if I'm looking at the front page view, which is, again, content on my site in teaser form, I can say that the default front page view is A, based on content that I'm creating. B, it's formatted as a list that's being shown as teasers of the content entities. C, that it's being filtered in the purposes of front page view, it's being filtered to only show content that I've published on the page. So don't show anything that's not published yet, that I haven't specified is ready for public consumption. But also only show me content that has that checkbox in the content interface that says promoted to the front page, because those are the things that I'm explicitly saying put them on the front page. They are sorted to keep, first of all, content that is marked as sticky at the very top of the list. So in the Drupal content editing interface, you have options to mark that sticky at the top of list, it's called. And that tells Drupal, in views like this front page view, I should first put sticky content at the top and then go through with the rest of my sort stuff, my sort criteria. It's a way of putting things that are very important that you want to stay, have prominence, to put those things at the top. So it's sorted by sticky content first, and then after it gets through all the sticky content, it's sorted chronologically, recent content going first on the page. Finally, all of that is displayed by Drupal as a page. And all that means is this view has a URL. I go to it by going to the front page of my Drupal site. The contents of this view comprise the main page content of this particular page. Similarly, that files view, that administrative list of files view that we saw, this is files, but like another good example is just the basic administrative content list of your site, which is another table that administrators see that help them be able to find content and manage their content in a tabular form rather than as teasers or something like that. If we look at the administrator file views, we can understand this to be it's based on files as opposed to content or users or some other type of entity in Drupal. This view is formatted as a table as opposed to a regular list. It's a table, and the columns of the entity that I'm viewing are shown as are the fields of my entity. So all of the titles of my files are arranged in that first column. All of the types of those files are arranged in the second column, and so forth. This view has filters as well on it, but these filters in this case are actually exposed filters. The difference being exposed filters are shown above the table in a way that the user viewing the view is able to provide their own input as to what the filters should be. So for instance, I have a file name filter here that is exposed that allows me viewing this view to enter a file name and have that be used as the filter option that controls what I'm seeing in this view. This also has some sort options. In this case, it's sorted chronologically by the date that the file was last changed, but it also has some sorting criteria on it that says if you've clicked on one of the headers, then sort this view by the property that's indicated by that header. So if I were to click on name, for example, then the sort options would be alphabetically by the file name. Finally, if we're going through that list of 5 basic components, the display type, similarly to the front page, this is being displayed to Drupal as a page. This view has a URL that you go to in your browser. It's associated with the URL. The contents of this view are associated with the main page content of this particular page. The third example that we looked at was the Who is Online view. And if we go through that same questions, then we can identify that this view is based on users, again, as opposed to content or as opposed to taxonomy terms or files. These are users of the site. The format of it is as a list, and it's being shown as rows of selected fields. And that may not make sense right now. We'll go through what that means a little later on. The view is filtered to only show active users, so only users that are not blocked on the site, and only users that have actually accessed the site, who have logged in and clicked around in the last 15 minutes. The sorting is, it puts the people who have logged in most recently or who have been active most recently at the very top of the view. And unlike the first two examples, the way that this is being displayed, the way that we've told Drupal to use this view is as a block. So rather than having a URL of its own, this view is going to be exposed to the block interface in Drupal. And I'm going to be able to place that block into a region in my theme and have it display across multiple pages and not be confined to a single page. Before we get to that, I want to stop and give you a chance to ask questions, because I'm actually going to do that quite a bit, because there are a lot of concepts to throw at you all at once. I know that we're going to cover some of it later on, but I just want to make sure that we're all okay for now. We doing good? Feel free, if you have a question, just to pipe up and interrupt me. I won't necessarily be looking for hands, because, again, I'm frazzled. But yeah, let me know. We'll stop and we'll go over what you have. So we've looked over the 5 basic components that comprise the definition of a view. I want to switch gears a little bit and just look at what the user interface for views looks like when that module is enabled and when you are going to edit the configuration of a view. So we're going to, for the purpose of the example, we're going to edit the Who's Online view. We're going to start doing that by going to our management area, our structure tab in our administrative menu, and then we're going to go down to the bottom where alphabetically views is located. And we're going to click that link that says views. A quick note for my iconography here, where you see an orange arrow, it usually indicates that I'm going to perform a click on that. Imagine that I am actually on a Drupal site and I've got my mouse and I've gone over and I've clicked on views. That's what happens here. So after clicking on views, it takes me to the administrative listing of views objects. So a couple things to see here. There's the button at the very top that says Add New View. We're going to do this later on in an example, but for the moment, we're not worried about adding new view. We just want to edit a view that currently exists. Underneath that is a text field that allows me to just filter through all of the views that are on my site. I've entered in Who here, which gives me the Who's New block and the Who's Online block. That also searches through the descriptions that are listed, that are associated with each view. It also searches through the tags that might have been associated with the view, so I can quickly winnow down this list to just the thing that I might be looking for. So the Who's Online block is the thing that I'm looking for. I'm going to scan over the Who's Online block to the edit operations. So this thing right here is actually called a drop button interface. The idea is that there's a default option, and that's to edit this view, but there are actually other operations that are available if I click on the drop-down arrow that's next to it. So if I were to click on that drop-down arrow, I would actually get a menu of other things that I might be able to do with this particular view. I could duplicate it, for example, so make a copy of it and work on the copy instead of working on the original. I could disable the view, which makes it not accessible to the general public for a while. It's like temporarily unpublishing the view if I'm not ready for it to be out there. Or I could just delete it. I could get rid of it because I decide I don't need it, and I'd rather it not be there. For our purposes, we're just going to go ahead and click that edit button. And that takes us to the edit interface for the Who's Online block. And this interface is a doozy, and I understand that we are going to do our best to try to figure out what each of the things on this page means. We're going to take it chunk by chunk, but I'm mostly focused on the things that are in this left-hand column. Those 5 basic components of the view that we talked about earlier, those are pretty much all in that left-hand column. And the things that you see in the middle there, those are some extra stuff that are nice to have. They're just not in the scope of this talk, but they'll allow you to do things like put some text above the view as a header, or put some text below it as a header, or determine what happens when there are no results that show up in the view. You can add no results behavior, so you can have text that would say like there's no content that matches your view, or something like that. We don't have time to talk about that, but they're there, and they're useful things to muddle through. And hopefully after this talk, you'll have at least some idea of the visual vocabulary of this page, so you'll have some idea of how to click through these things on your own. So this is the edit interface. If we quickly actually scroll down, you see that there's also an embedded preview area in the view, which is actually a really nice feature. As you go through and change various configuration options in your view, you can scroll down to the preview and see how your configuration changes will affect what is rendered or in the view. Scrolling back up to the page, let's first talk about first things first is I'm going to call out this tour icon that's hanging out in the top right. The tour module, if it's enabled, if you see tour in the top right in your admin bar and you click it, those are usually those are nice little modal windows that pop up, and they point at things on the screen and give you an idea of what that thing is, what that thing in the interface is. It's a way of putting help text on an unfamiliar page, and pointing you at some hints for how that thing is used. It's not in all places in core, but it is on this page, and it can be helpful when you see it to click on that. That's a nice handy thing to know about. So the first thing at the top of the page is the view that we're looking at, and it's the who's online block. And in the parentheses, you see that it says user in there. In those parentheses, that is actually the where we talked about what is this view based on. The parentheses indicate what this view is based on. In this case, the basis for this view are user entities. Users are the things that we are listing in this view. If I were looking at a list of blog posts, for example, instead, if that were the view I were looking at, in the parentheses you'd see content, because it'd be a view based on content. The base is the only thing about the view which you cannot change after the fact. After you created a view and you've said that it's based on users, that view is always going to be based on users. If you made a mistake there, you'd have to delete it and start with a different view instead. Literally everything else about the view you can change after the fact by editing it in this interface, just not the base. The next thing in the display to look at in this interface are the list of displays, which was that fifth component that we talked about. Displays are a little bit confusing. We're going to actually break out of this a bit and talk about that. Displays represent different ways that you can form a view, different ways that you might be viewing a particular view on a page or as a page. This is an interesting concept. It's hard to explain exactly, except to say that so the concept I came out with, and it's a terrible one, so bear with me. I am less than. I have exactly one display. This is how I look, and I might put on different clothes, but I'm essentially, I have a head and I have 2 arms and 2 legs. I have one display that the world can use of me. Optimus Prime, on the other hand, has 2 displays. Optimus Prime has a robot display. Optimus Prime also has a truck display. These things are both Optimus Prime. They are essentially Optimus Prime, but they behave very differently based on the context that you give them. One of them is an awesome robot. One of them is a not-so-awesome tractor-trailer truck, whatever it is. But they are still both essentially Optimus Prime. The idea with displays is that you can do the same thing with your view. You might have a view that has a page display, so it has a URL. It's something that you're meant to navigate to in the navigation and display as the main page content. But it might have a secondary display that would be a block that is listing the same content, but it's not meant to be on its own page. It's meant to be embedded on several different pages. So you can have many displays in a view. You don't have to have just one. You can have 100 displays in your view. There's no limitation on that. The way that works is if we are looking back at that list of displays and just focusing on that, if I click the Add button, I am going to be telling this view I'm going to add a display to this view. That Add button is actually a drop-down that gives us different types of displays that we can add to the page. If I were to pick one of those display options, then I would get another display added to this row. And so here, what's indicated is that I clicked on that Add Page display. Page is now black on this bar. That's highlighted to indicate that the display that we are editing is the page display now instead of the Who's Online display. It also has an asterisk on there to indicate that you haven't saved this view yet. There are unsaved changes. And so if you were to add 3 displays, this row would just get longer and longer as you added more displays to this. The type of display that you have determines, again, how Drupal is going to use the display. We talked a little bit about pages and blocks as different display types, and honestly, those are probably the most important ones. There are other types that are available in Drupal core, and I put them here not because I want to talk about them at all. I just put them here for the sake of completeness in case anybody is following on these slides later on without the benefit of somebody explaining them, just to have them out there. But we're mostly going to focus on block and page. But there is an example in Drupal core about a display that has 2 pages, and it's that front page view. We talked about what the page display looks like. It's these two content teasers stacked on top of each other. But in the bottom left corner of that is an RSS feed icon. That actually refers to a second display that is on this view. It's a display of feeds meant for an RSS feed. So if I were to click on that RSS link, I would see my RSS output. That's the screenshot on the right. And that's something that I can use to plug into Feedly or when Google Reader was still a thing, you could plug it into Google Reader. I miss Google Reader. Or whatever feed aggregator that you might personally use to be able to aggregate your own content. But the important takeaway, this is a view with two displays. The feed display is actually attached to the page display, so that's how the page display knows that it needs to render that button for the feed display as well. This is one of those examples where it makes sense for one view to have two different displays, two different ways this view is used by Drupal. So that being said, the caveat that I have is that you should, most of the time, should only be using one display per view. And that's because I find that it gets really frustrating and confusing sometimes when you have multiple displays on one view. Displays on one view share a lot of configuration options. And it's really easy to accidentally change something that you only meant to change in one display, but change it for all of the other displays in your view. It gets really complicated at times, and you can make mistakes that are actually really, really difficult to recover from once your views start to get more and more complex. And I'd say that you can eliminate a lot of that complexity by actually just making multiple different views, each that has one display. That can save you a lot of confusion. And in a lot of instances, I think that if you are feeling like maybe you might be looking at two displays, consider whether or not it's possible that you actually would be better off creating separate views with different displays, with one display each. I feel like that's a confusing point, and if there's anything that isn't clear about that, or if you have questions about that, it's a good time now to talk about that. Yeah?
Do you have an example of when you would want two displays?
So the best example that I can think of is like this one, right? So the one where we have a page display and a feed display. You technically wouldn't need this to be two views, or you wouldn't need this to be one view. You could have it be one view that is the front page display, and then another view which is an RSS feed. The benefit of having two displays here is you can have the feed display specifically attach itself to the page display, and that puts that icon in the corner. And that's pretty much only possible because they are on the same view. There are options in the feed display, I believe, that tells it what other displays in this view to attach itself to. And so that's an example where the particular configuration options that are available to feed displays make it so that it's meant to be used with another display in the same view. But if you just wanted an RSS feed to be available, you didn't care about the icon, you could absolutely get away with having that as a front page view and an RSS XML view. Anything else?
How can you tell where to show the display? Like, you want it to be a certain page or several pages?
Sure. So the question is, how do you tell Drupal, I believe, how to use the view, whether it's going to be one page or separate pages? So if it's going to be on one page, that would indicate to me that you intend to create a page display, and the page display has configuration options where you give it the URL that's associated with that view, and that is the way you would tell Drupal that this view corresponds to this URL. So if I'm making a page display for my articles and I want that to live at /articles on my site, I'd make a page display. In the configuration for that, I would write /articles in for the URL, and Drupal would automatically register that as a path and know that the main content of that was the article. If, on the other hand, you were trying to build a view of most recent articles and you want to display that on multiple pages throughout the site, you'd probably create that as a block display. And once that block display view has been saved, you would go to your block interface in Drupal, and you would use that interface. You'd click the place block button that is associated with a region that gives you a list of all the blocks that are registered to Drupal, and that view will then be registered as a block that you can place on the page through normal Drupal core block interface means. Does that make sense?
And when view is displayed like a page, how can we edit the metadata?
The metadata for a view? That's an interesting question. I believe there are contributed modules that expose some options for that on the views interface. I am not sure about that entirely, but I also know that the meta tags module in Drupal 8 and Drupal 7 actually both have things in their ecosystem that allow you to set meta tags for a particular path. So not like, it wouldn't be in the views interface, it'd be in the meta tags interface instead, but that would be a place you might look instead. Anything else? Okay, we're gonna move on back to this configuration page. So the displays, to locate on the page again, we are in that gray bar at the very top where the displays are. In that gray bar also is the operations drop button that give us control over what to do with this view as a whole. So like we can edit the name of the view, the description that shows up on the administrative listing for the page, or tags for the particular view. We could also duplicate the view from here or delete the view from this drop button in the gray bar. These aren't related to displays. These drop button operations are related to the entire view, all of the displays in the view. Below that gray bar, this area, this whole rectangle, this is display configuration for the active display, for the display that is highlighted in black. And so if we had multiple displays, the things that we are seeing here would affect that active view and not the unhighlighted views. But because of the weird ways in which views share configuration, it might affect all of the other displays too. It's part of the reason why I didn't want to get into it here, and part of the reason why I sort of recommend that you get away from that and try to do one view per display if at all possible, until you really are comfortable knowing what the implications of that are. The display configuration has its own set of drop buttons, and these drop buttons here in the top right corner up here, those operations are for the display within the view. And so I can duplicate displays, or I can remove displays from this view, or rename them so that instead of who's online, I might rename this who's online view to recently updated or something like that. We won't go into those in detail. They're there. The control buttons for the view for saving the changes that we made to the view are in a gray bar below that configuration. So I can make a bunch of changes to configuration in my display. I can make a bunch of changes to multiple displays if I have multiple displays in the view. They aren't going to be saved to the database until I click that save button. So you can preview a bunch of changes first before hitting save. And if you don't like those, if you made a mistake, you can cancel and discard any changes, unsaved changes that you might have made. Okay. Let's clue in on those display configurations. And again, we're mostly going to be concerned with the things that are in that left-hand column, because these are the most important things that control how the view behaves. So in that left-hand column, there's, in capital letters, there are categories for different kinds of configuration on that page. So like there's the title category of a configuration for this display, and it's got as its configuration item, one of them, the title configuration item and the value of that, which is labeled as who's online. All of the configuration settings that you can change in a view display are rendered as links on this interface. The link text indicates what the current set value is of that configuration item, that component, and clicking on it allows you to change what that component is, or what it says, or what its settings are. So if I'm clicking on that who's online link here, what I'm actually asking is, I'm asking the interface to update or change that value. So when I click on one of those, a modal pops up over the page. That modal has this thing here, which indicates whether or not I want to change this for all of the displays in the view or just certain displays in the view. I'm putting it here because it's there, and I'm going to ignore it from here on out because I'm going to assume that you're going to not use this and only use one display per page or per view until you have a better handle on what's going on there. I don't know if that was obvious there. I am changing the title of this. Instead of who's online, I've changed this to recent visitors. And I'm going to click on that apply to all displays button. So that is going to return us. It's going to close that modal and return us to the configuration page. The text of the title has changed from who's online to recent visitors in the configuration item. And furthermore, if I want to make sure that that is in fact what happened, I can scroll down to the preview area, and I can see that the title of that is listed there is now recent visitors instead of who's online. it bears mentioning here, this preview is not like it's not meant to be a literal preview. This is not actually how this view is going to look on the site. It's more of an informational preview, so you can see how the changes you are making might affect what the view actually does, or what's listed in the view. If we want to actually see what changes, how this change is affected on the actual site, we would save it, go back and look at the site. We'd see that the title of that block has changed. It's no longer who's in line. It says recent visitors. Any questions about that interface? About how that pattern works?
After the view is created, how can we know it's a page display or a block display?
That is a good question, actually. You are going to be creating for views that you're creating, you will choose the display that you're creating at the time that you create the view, and we'll go over an example of that later on. Probably the easiest way to think about or to know in advance what kind of display you're on, the way that I guess unconsciously that I've always done is to look at some of the settings that are available to you in that middle column. So like that middle column, the very top thing says block settings. That tells me, that's actually a good point. It's not obvious what kind of display is listed in that display tab, which is where I would think that we'd label it. But contextually, by looking at the configuration options, I know that this is a block because it says block settings there. If this had been a page display, we would have an item here that says like page settings here, and you'd have like the URL to set as well. That's a good point, though. It's not necessarily obvious what kind of display it is, and that's a relatively important thing. I can only say look at that middle column to try to get an idea of context. Did you have another question, by the way, since we're...
Yeah, if we create a view into a page, will it have a title tag?
If you create a view on a page, will there be a title tag? The answer is yes. In this case, if this were a page, then the title that you see that we just edited to recent visitors, that would not be the title of the block because it's not a block. Instead, that would be the title of the page. So that is now the title tag. That behaves as the title tag when we are using the page display. Cool. Okay, moving back to where we were. So, okay, that's editing display configurations particularly. We talked a little bit about the base, which is set at the very beginning when you create a view. I'm moving on to that second component of the 5 that we're talking about, which is formatting. So formatting, that's right underneath title in our left-hand column. Formatting has 2 subcomponents that are listed under it. There's format and there's show. Both of them are related to how we are going to be displaying items on the page. Format refers to the arrangement of items in the view. It's also, sometimes you'll see it in the interface called style format, and that has to do with just old nomenclature that comes from Drupal 5 and being upgraded over and over again. But so format, style format, they really are referring to the same thing. In this instance, in the example here, the format selected is HTML list, which renders all of my items within generically just div wrappers, div HTML wrappers. The other component of the formatting area is called show. It's labeled as show. It's also sometimes called the row format. The idea behind show is for each particular item in my view, how are we going to display it? How are we going to render that individual item? What should that individual item look like? So format is how are we arranging multiple items? Show is how are we displaying individual items? We'll talk about some of that a little more. So like cluing in on that format thing, for example. I've pulled out 2 examples of formats that are available in Drupal core. There's, for instance, a grid format and a table format. I've also I've added, I skipped ahead a little bit in this example, and I've added a field to my view to also show me the email address of all of these users. And that just helps me, I think it helps illustrate these examples. So for example, looking at the grid view, we see that all of the items are displayed together as one sort of blob in each area, but each of those items is arranged in a 2x2 grid in this particular block. As opposed to the table, where instead of being a grid of items, it is each record, each item is a row in my table. Each column refers to a field that I've configured on this item. There are other types of formats that are available in Drupal core. There's HTML list, which again is just an unstyled just ordering of items top to bottom. There are HTML lists, which are structured lists. Like if you know HTML, it'd be a UL tag or an OL tag, something that either gives you like a generic bullet point or a numbered 1, 2, 3 listing for each of your items. So these are for core provided components, but if you install contrib modules, they can oftentimes add additional types of formats. So for example, if you were to install the Flex Slider module, for example, Flex Slider is a jQuery plugin that renders a bunch of things together into a slideshow, for example, and it's responsive and it's nice and it's free and open source. There's a contributed Flex Slider module that you can install, and it provides a Flex Slider format for your view instead. So instead of viewing it as a grid, maybe I want to view these items as a slideshow instead. That's an example of contributed modules extending this interface and giving us more options than what might be available. Each formatting option has its own additional settings. I want to just actually go back here so you see that the format selected here is HTML list. And if I had clicked on HTML list in this area, I'd be able to change it into one of these 4 other formats. Next to HTML list, there is that pipe character and then settings. So that is additional configuration that corresponds to the choice that I've made to the left of it. So in this case, if I click on settings, that gives me additional configurations for how this HTML list is going to be arranged. Here's an example of that. This is the settings modal that shows up when I'm configuring a grid format. So there are options here that only make sense in the context of grid formats, like it's asking me how many columns that I want to display or use for my grid. In this case, I only wanted 2, but like maybe on a page display where I have more width or more room, I'd want to have as many as maybe 4 or something like that. Should I automatically be calculating the widths? Should I arrange the items in the grid horizontally or vertically? Like should they tile across the page or should they tile down the page, for example? And then some things that are available to all formatting types, like a grouping field. Not something we're going to talk about, but there are some things that are shared between different formatting types. Likewise, the show component, which is, again, how we are displaying individual items, not arranging several items in a view, but how we are displaying an individual item, what that item should look like. The show component, there are 2 options provided by core. One is fields, which is I want to actually choose exactly the fields that I want to display on from these objects in my view. The second object, in this example, it says user, and that's because the basis of this view is a user. But if the basis of the view were content, it would say content. If it were a taxonomy term, it would say taxonomy term. When you select the user or the content row style type, show type, you are saying, I'm going to be displaying this entity using one of its default display modes. And that's a concept that is out of the scope of this discussion. But basically in Drupal, there's all of the things that you display are entities, whether they're content or users or taxonomy terms. Those entities have different ways that you can display them on a page, whether they're going to be the full version of it that you see when you go to the page for that entity, or whether it's a teaser view for that entity, or whether you've created like a short listing sort of view mode for the end of your display mode. When you select in the show component user or content, you're saying, I want to display this item the way that we pre-configured these items to display. That's maybe a little bit confusing, but hopefully it clears up a little bit with some of these examples. Just like the formatting option, each of the show options have their own additional settings as well. So for example, if I had chosen user as my show option, I would have settings for that which allow me to determine whether or not I'm going to show that entity as a compact view mode or show it using the default view mode. Another thing to know is that when I'm doing that, I don't get the option to specify the fields that I'm going to show on my entity, because those are being controlled by the entity view mode itself. And so this this field area. That's why this fields area below us says the selected style or role format does not use fields. Well, we'll talk about that in a second as well. I just wanted to mention it because that happens immediately when you choose the user or content or taxonomy term show option. But the examples of that would be, so like if I'm going to go back to that recent visitors view, and if I were to change the way that the formatting options were arranged so that I wanted to format as a grid with 2 columns, and that I wanted to show user entities with the compact view mode, this is what we would get. So the arrangement, the formatting, is now a grid with 2 columns, and it's arranged horizontally. So the llama user is first, followed by, I forget what the second username was. I think it was Tom Tomato, and then it was Les Lim. And so instead of seeing the fields that represent those entities, the name and the email that we had configured before, now we're seeing the compact view mode of the user entity, which is that pre-configured way of displaying the entity that comes out of Drupal already. In this case, the compact view mode shows us the pictures, the thumbnail pictures that all the users have updated. So this is a great way to be able to reuse ways that we've defined entities to be displayed. That's actually a lot to digest right now. Let's stop there with that. And are there questions about formatting? I feel like I muddled through that too pretty well. We're good?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm kind of following along in Drupal 8 with you. And when I click on show, I have another option, which is search results.
Sure.
What's search results?
You probably have core search module enabled.
Okay.
And so the idea is that you might be able to replace your regular search pages with a view instead. So a view where you might be able to provide like a keyword filter and then show snippets of the results that come up.
So what that user searched for on your site?
No, it would be a way of replacing the search functionality on your site. So instead of the regular search page, you might be able to have a page that you are returning search results for. And so the type of item that I'm showing isn't going to be the entity. It's not going to be individual fields, but it's going to be a search result. And I think that the idea behind that is the search module is telling views, I'm going to give you this other way of showing this entity that allows me to get this snippet of text that has your keyword highlighted and stuff like that, which otherwise wouldn't be possible without the search module enabled. But that's an example of another module you turn on, adding options and adding strength to what views has available to it. Yeah.
Similar question. When I go to structure and then views, I have different columns than you have, and I was just wondering.
Interesting. I have no idea what you're saying. So you are seeing different columns when you go to the display?
Yeah, I have view name, machine name, description, display is
View name, machine name. Are you
actually in the listing of views.
you are in the listing of views?
Yeah.
Are you on Drupal 8 or are you on Drupal 7? Okay. So that would be going back quite a ways here to this. This listings page.
Yeah, I don't have escape or tab.
I don't know.
That's interesting. Do you have the views user interface module turned on, possibly? And I should also mention these slides were taken a year ago, and the interfaces might have changed. I honestly don't even, it doesn't even register me when that happens, so this looks totally fine to me. I have no idea. This was correct as of a month ago, but if these columns have changed in some way, then I don't believe they changed in any major ways. Like, it's still, are you missing things here that are relevant to the following along of what we were doing?
I
Or
was mainly just wondering because
Okay.
I don't have the tag.
okay.
It's okay.
That's a fair point. I should have mentioned that up front. That these slides are actually like a year old now at this point, and so some things may have some minor differences. The concepts are all the same.
Go to the settings button. There are some options to turn things on, and displays is one of the columns we have that you do not have, and that will put the path in there.
I see. So the settings tab that you see, list is highlighted right now, and so we're seeing the list
And
of views. But
unturned on
right.
always show advanced display settings, and then that turned on the paths where those things are used.
Okay.
What they are.
That might make some sense. So you have some control over how complex your display is by looking at the settings that are available in the configuration as well. So let's skip ahead. Let's get back to where we were. We're getting pretty close, actually, to the end of this here. Or are we? Yeah, we're pretty close. I want to talk about fields. So fields are part. I consider these part of formats, and they are. If you had chosen to show fields instead of showing users, then fields would allow you to pick and choose items from this entity that you want to use as your item, your displayed item within this view. And you can add any number of fields. You can add fields multiple times, even the same field multiple times. That's all done by interrogating or using this drop button. This has the add option by default. It can also rearrange fields that are in this interface. But we're going to go ahead and click on add right now. That brings up a modal window where we're searching through all of the fields that are available to add into this type of display at the moment. And there are some controls at the top that will help you filter this list down, because this list can get very large. So I can search for things. I can start searching for a particular field that I'm looking for, or I can change the category of things in this display in order to winnow down to one particular thing. So in this case, I'm going to search for mail, because I'm going to try to add the email field to my list of fields to display for each item. So I type in mail. It gives me two options, email and initial email. And I'm going to click on email because that corresponds to what Drupal considers to be the current email address for this user. So I check that box. And then I check the apply button. And that brings me to another modal window where I'm now configuring the options that correspond to this field that I'm adding. And the field's got its own set of configuration settings as well. There is a formatter. Well, first of all, there's create a label, which allows you to say, like, I want all of the times when I'm showing the email address to have the word email with a colon behind it, and I can configure what that label looks like. There's exclude from display, which is I don't want to remove this item, but I don't want to show it in the item right now. The formatter gives us different ways that we might want this to be rendered. Plain text is shown right now, but in this option, I might be able to also choose mail to link. So instead of plain text, this renders as a link, and that's going to be, when you click it, it's going to open up whatever default mail browser that you have on your computer with a draft email to that person already set out. If we open up these field sets, there's also style settings. Where I can customize like the ways that I'm wrapping this field, the HTML that's used to contain the value. I can add classes to it as well if I want that for CSS purposes to be able to style things. I can add classes to the wrappers of the item. Rewrite results is another option that's available to a field. This is an interesting one. I can actually change what the output of the field is by using a token replacement system. And the idea is, say I don't want to just display the raw email for this field that I'm adding. I actually want to display a nice little sentence that says, Les's email address is lesmonolim@gmail.com, and I want that in strong tags. So I've enabled in this interface override the output of this field with custom text. I put in the text that I desire to be in there, and you'll see that you have like these double bracket things that have name and email in them. Those are taken from this replacements patterns dropdown. If we click on that to open it, we see that we have a list of tokens, basically, that are available that when I put them into my text, Drupal sees that token and replaces it with the actual value from this item. And these tokens are available because I've added them as fields previously. So any field that you've added to this display is available as a token in the replacement patterns that I can use when I'm rewriting this output. So if I were to save this field example with this overwritten rewrite results text, this is the example that I would get instead in my recent visitors block. There's my title, or my name, my username, but then there's also this username field, which is my overwritten output text for that particular field. There's another option for field configuration, which is no results behavior, and this is if I don't have an email address in the system, what should I show? Should I show anything? Should I show the label still? This allows you to have sane default values for like just displaying like things like no email address given in the case of not having a thing there. It's totally optional, but it's nice to be able to give users some context about why they're not seeing something, for example. Fields can be reordered on the display. If I go to that drop button and click it, then I have rearrange as an option as well. That just gives me a listing of all the fields with draggable handles on it, so I can change the order. That is fields. I should stop here for a minute and talk about, before I go on to filter criteria, are there any questions about the fields? Okay, cool. We're running up in 4 minutes, so this is actually probably, we're going to basically just barely get through the 5 criteria. And I think I'm probably not going to be able to show you the process of creating a new view. If you want to stay a little bit, there is a video I can show you for that, or I can refer you to other resources, but we're coming up pretty soon here. I do think we can get through at least filter criteria. Filter criteria are, again, the rules that determine which items you're going to display. So beyond the fact that you are displaying users, which users are you going to display in this view? So for the recent visitors, we've told it that we are going to only show things where the user status equals yes, and that's a bit of a Drupalism. It's not really yes, it's active users, but for the purposes of Drupal, it says that yes, the user status is active, as opposed to no, the user status is not active. We also have a filter in there configured for the last access property, and the last access property is, it says ampersand GT, that's just a bug in my screenshot. That should be greater than. So you interpret that as this filter, the second filter is, we will only want users who last accessed the site more than 15 minutes ago. So within the last 15 minutes, those users. The interface for this works exactly the same way that Fields does. When I click the Add button, I get a modal that shows me filter options. Filter options have, when I click on one of these items, I get to the filter options to edit one of those things. So if I want to edit the criteria for this last access filter, I get this modal window that gives me some configuration options for filters. I can change the operator. So maybe I don't want greater than or equal to. Maybe I want the operator to be less than. I want users who have not logged in recently. I also have the ability to change what the value is, the static value for this filter is, by changing the text in that value field. So there's also a checkbox, and I should have labeled this better. The checkbox at the top of that modal that says expose this filter to visitors, allowing them to change it. This allows you to ignore the static value that you have typed in, that you as the administrator have typed in, and allow the person who is seeing this block or seeing this view to provide their own values to filter the listing in their own way. So for example, if I were to click on the expose this filter to visitors checkbox, I get some additional options. For example, I get to be able to label what the form element for this looks like when people visit the view and need to interact with the way this filter works. It's going to be a drop-down that says last access on it, and they're going to be able to change that value to something else, to minus 30 minutes or minus 45 minutes or whatever makes sense for whatever they're looking for. This works best with page displays. It doesn't really work very well with block displays for various reasons I don't want to get into, but that's one caveat that they're mostly meant for use with page displays. Exposed filters I'm talking about. And then quickly, sort criteria, they work very similarly in the way that the interface works to fields and filters. They have add and rearrange buttons, but they are rules that determine the order in which we're going to display the items, the rows in the view. And it goes in priority, so like the first listed one is the highest priority sort criteria. And then if there are ties in that sort criteria, then it progresses to the next listed sort criteria, and then the next listed sort criteria, and so on. So clicking on that gives me an array of options for how I'm going to sort this thing, whether I want to sort them descending, like in order of greatest to least, or I want to sort it ascending in order from least to greatest. And then some sorts also have additional options that I'm not going to get into here. This is where I would normally go through a scenario of creating a view, but we are right at 11:30, unfortunately. And I don't know how the time got away from me. That really sucks. I'm so sorry. But there actually is an example of this same talk that I gave at MidCamp last year. I can put up the slides for that and put up the recording of that video. If you're interested, you can hit that up at about the 40-minute mark, and I will put that in the session description for this session on the website. So if you want to go back and see what the creating a view process looks like, you can go back to that link. And I'll put them in I'll update the session slides as well. So if you want to go back to the session slides, you can do that as well. That's 11:30. I'm supposed to let you go. I'm willing to stick around here for a bit and answer questions. But otherwise, yeah, thanks for coming. Sorry for running out of time.